A dog was born with a deformed leg and was thought to be on the verge of death, but a miracle suddenly happened because Turbo was born on a cold, rainy night. In the corner of a small kennel, a Chihuahua mother had just finished giving birth. 4 tiny, fragile puppies, their eyes still shut, nestled together for warmth. But among them there was one that was noticeably smaller, shivering and frail. The owner, Jake, frowned as he noticed something unusual. "Emily, look at this." "Emily?" His wife leaned in closer, her eyes widening in both surprise and sorrow. Turbo was different. He had no front legs, only 2 tiny hind legs kicked weakly, while his upper body was missing what should have been there. Emily exhaled sharply, a painful squeeze in her chest. "Poor thing, how is he supposed to survive?" Jake shook his head. He had heard of puppies born with congenital defects before. Most of them never lived long. The weaker ones in the litter wouldn't be able to compete for their mother's milk, would be left behind, and eventually they would perish. Everyone around them had the same advice. Just euthanize him. A puppy like that will never have a normal life. Emily looked down at Turbo. He was so tiny, his little body trembling from the cold. Those round, innocent eyes gazed up at her, unaware of the cruel world he had just entered. She couldn't do it. "We'll try to take care of him. At least let's give him a chance." Jake sighed, but he knew his wife well. Once she had made up her mind, nothing would change it. The following days were a real battle. Turbo was so weak that he couldn't even find his way to his mother's milk. His siblings pushed him aside, leaving him with nothing. Every time he tried to inch his way toward his mother, his tiny body tipped forward, unable to balance. Emily and Jake began feeding Turbo with a small milk bottle. At night, they took turns staying up to ensure he wasn't smothered by his stronger siblings. Every time Turbo let out a weak whimper, Emily jolted awake. But the biggest challenge still lay ahead. Turbo couldn't move. While the other puppies started crawling and exploring their small world, Turbo remained stuck, helplessly kicking his hind legs. Jake watched him, his face heavy with worry. How can he survive if he can't even move? Emily was silent for a moment. Then she lifted her head, her gaze determined. "We'll find a way to help him walk, no matter how hard it is." Turbo, the little warrior, had no idea that he was about to embark on an extraordinary journey. Turbo grew much more slowly than his siblings. While the other puppies were crawling around, exploring their tiny world, he remained stuck in place, desperately kicking his hind legs in a futile attempt to move. Every time he tried, his small body tipped forward, and he ended up face first on the ground. The other puppies played, nipping at each other's ears, while Turbo could only whimper in frustration, watching them from the sidelines. Emily's heart ached every time she saw him struggle. She could see the determination in his eyes, but no matter how hard he tried, he simply couldn't move like the others. Jake, watching Turbo's constant failures, couldn't help but voice his concerns. "I don't know if we're doing the right thing," he said one night, watching Emily cradle the tiny dog in her hands. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at Turbo, his little body curled up against her for warmth. "He hasn't given up," she finally whispered. "So why should we?" Jake sighed but smiled softly. "Then we'll help him, no matter what it takes." The first major challenge was feeding him. Without front legs, he couldn't balance properly when lowering his head to eat. Every time he tried, his body would tip forward, sending his tiny face straight into his food bowl. Emily and Jake took turns holding him steady during meals, but they knew that wasn't a long-term solution. Turbo needed to learn how to eat on his own. After multiple failed attempts, they discovered that raising the food bowl slightly off the ground allowed him to push food into his mouth with his nose without falling over. It was a small victory, but it gave them hope. Yet, it didn't solve the biggest problem. Turbo still couldn't move. By the time he was 2 months old, his siblings were running, jumping, and playing all over the house. Turbo, meanwhile, could only struggle to drag himself a few inches forward. His tiny body wasn't strong enough to support the effort, and every time he collapsed in exhaustion, he let out a tiny whimper, but even then he never stopped trying. "This little guy has more determination than I've ever seen," Jake murmured one evening, watching Turbo attempt to crawl toward him. Determination alone, however, wasn't enough. Turbo needed a real solution. Realizing they couldn't do this alone, Emily reached out for help. She took Turbo to see Dr. Emma, a veterinarian known for her compassion toward animals with disabilities. The moment Emma saw Turbo, she smiled. "This little guy has a fighter's spirit," she said, gently stroking his fur. But after examining him, she admitted a difficult truth. Three-legged dogs can adjust, but Turbo's case is different. He won't be able to walk without support. Emily and Jake felt a flicker of hope when she mentioned mobility aids, but their relief was short-lived. No wheelchair small enough for Turbo existed. The models available were all designed for larger dogs, and Turbo's tiny frame simply wasn't big enough to use them. Emily's heart sank. "So, what do we do?" she asked desperately. Emma thought for a moment, then smiled. "If nothing exists, we'll build one ourselves." In the days that followed, Emma and her team worked on designing a tiny, lightweight wheelchair just for Turbo. They used small plastic tubes, toy airplane wheels, and soft harness straps to create a makeshift frame. It was a delicate process, requiring multiple adjustments to ensure the fit was just right. When they finally placed Turbo into his custom wheelchair for the first time, he stood motionless, confused by the strange sensation. Then, instinct took over. Slowly, he lifted his hind legs and pushed forward. The tiny wheels rolled slightly. Turbo hesitated, but then tried again. This time, he moved a little farther. His confidence grew, and soon he was rolling across the clinic floor, his tail wagging in excitement. Emily burst into tears. Jake pulled her close, his eyes shining with pride. Emma, watching from the side, beamed. "This little guy is a true warrior," she said. But the journey was far from over. The wheelchair allowed Turbo to move, but he still had a lot to learn. At first, he struggled to turn without losing his balance. The wheels were small, making it difficult for him to roll over uneven surfaces, and in his excitement he often moved too fast, crashing into furniture and walls. But Turbo refused to be discouraged. He practiced every day, gradually learning how to control his movements. Within 2 weeks, he had mastered his little wheelchair. Now he could go anywhere. He zipped around effortlessly, chasing falling leaves and barking joyfully whenever Emily called his name. For the first time in his life, he had the freedom to move on his own terms. But Turbo's story was far from over. As he grew, it became clear that his current wheelchair wouldn't last forever. Sooner or later, he would need something stronger, something built to support him in the long run. And just when he needed it most, a new figure entered his life. Mark Dedrick, a 3D design engineer who would create the next miracle for Turbo. For now, though, Turbo enjoyed every moment of his newfound freedom, surrounded by love, patience, and the kindness of those who refused to give up on him. Because every life, no matter how small or imperfect, deserves the chance to be lived to the fullest. Turbo had mastered his tiny wheelchair. He rolled through the house confidently, chasing dust particles and wagging his tail whenever Emily called his name. The once helpless puppy was now full of life, moving as if he had never been without legs in the first place. But as he grew, so did his problems. His makeshift wheelchair, built from toy airplane wheels and plastic tubes, was becoming too small. The straps that once held him snugly now dug into his sides, and the tiny wheels struggled to keep up with his increasing strength. Emily and Jake noticed it right away. Turbo was still trying to move as fast as before, but his wheelchair was holding him back. More than once he tried to run, only to tip forward when the wheels couldn't handle the pressure. The little dog would whimper in frustration, nudging at his worn-out wheelchair as if telling his owners, "This isn't working anymore." "He needs a new one," Jake said one evening as Turbo sat beside them. Panting from exhaustion after another failed attempt at running, Emily sighed. "But where do we get one? The ones on the market are still too big and he's still growing." That was when Emma suggested something different. "I have a friend," she told them. "He works in 3D design and might be able to create something custom for Turbo." That friend was Mark Dedrick, a 3D design engineer who specialized in making prosthetics for animals. When he heard Turbo's story, he was immediately on board. "I love a good challenge," he told Emily when they first met, "and Turbo sounds like one determined little dog." The process wasn't easy. Mark needed precise measurements of Turbo's body, his weight, and how he moved. He spent days designing a lightweight, durable wheelchair that could adapt to Turbo's growing body. Instead of toy parts, he used high-quality 3D printed materials, ensuring that the frame would last longer and provide better mobility. 2 weeks later, the wheelchair was ready. Emily and Jake watched nervously as Mark placed Turbo into his brand-new, sleek, custom-made wheelchair. The difference was immediate. Turbo stood still for a moment, adjusting to the new fit. Then, with one powerful push from his hind legs, he took off across the room like a rocket. The new wheels glided effortlessly across the floor, responding to his every move. He turned smoothly, dodging obstacles, barking in excitement as if he had just discovered a new superpower. Emily covered her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "Look at him go!" Jake laughed. "I think we just created a speed demon." Turbo zoomed around the house, free and unstoppable. He was no longer just surviving, he was truly living. And this was only the beginning of his next great adventure. Turbo's new wheelchair had transformed his life. With the lightweight, custom-made frame supporting him, he was faster, more agile, and most importantly, independent. No longer was he a helpless puppy struggling to keep up. He was now a force of energy, zooming across the yard, chasing leaves and barking excitedly at every new discovery. But with his newfound speed came new challenges. Turbo, in all his enthusiasm, had not yet mastered control. More than once he miscalculated a turn and crashed into a table leg. Other times he got too excited and ended up tipping himself over in the grass, his little wheels spinning helplessly in the air. Emily and Jake quickly realized that Turbo needed more than just a wheelchair. He needed training. At first, training Turbo seemed impossible. He was full of energy and too eager to move, ignoring any attempts to teach him how to navigate carefully. But Emily was patient. She worked with him every day, guiding him through obstacles, teaching him when to slow down, and rewarding him whenever he maneuvered correctly. Jake even set up a small course in the backyard, using cones and boxes to help Turbo practice his turns. It wasn't easy, but Turbo was determined. Day by day, he got better. He learned how to shift his weight properly, how to adjust his speed when approaching sharp turns, and how to stop without toppling forward. One afternoon, after weeks of training, Emily called Turbo from across the yard. He looked up, ears perking at the sound of her voice. Then, with perfect control, he raced toward her, weaving effortlessly through the obstacle course Jake had set up. He avoided every cone, made every turn flawlessly, and stopped right at Emily's feet without falling over. Jake whistled. "I think we just turned Turbo into a professional racer." Emily laughed, scooping Turbo into her arms. "He's amazing." Turbo, always eager for more, wagged his tail, looking up at them with bright eyes as if saying, "What's next?" And something was next. Something none of them had expected. One day, while taking Turbo for a walk at the park, Emily noticed a small crowd gathering near a group of children. As she got closer, she realized they were watching a boy in a wheelchair. He was struggling to push himself forward, frustration clear on his face. His parents stood nearby, encouraging him, but he looked close to giving up. Then, before Emily could react, Turbo raced toward the boy. At first, the child looked startled, but then he saw Turbo, this tiny chihuahua with wheels of his own, zipping confidently through the grass, tail wagging like crazy. The boy's eyes widened. A moment later, a small smile appeared on his face. He adjusted his hands on his wheels and tried again. This time, he didn't stop. Emily felt her heart swell. Turbo wasn't just changing his own life, he was inspiring others to keep going too. Life with Turbo had never been dull. Ever since he got his custom-made wheelchair, he had become a whirlwind of energy, always on the move, always eager for the next adventure. For Emily and Jake, watching him run freely was nothing short of a miracle. But what they hadn't anticipated was how much of an impact Turbo would have, not just on them, but on everyone who met him. After the encounter at the park, where Turbo had unintentionally inspired a young boy in a wheelchair to keep trying, Emily couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. "Did you see the way that boy looked at him?" she asked Jake that night. It was like Turbo gave him hope. Jake nodded. Turbo doesn't know he's different. He doesn't see limits, only possibilities. Maybe that's exactly what people need to see. That thought lingered in Emily's mind, and soon she found herself wanting to share Turbo's story with more people. She began posting short videos of his journey on social media. Clips of him zooming across the yard, successfully navigating an obstacle course, and even his clumsy but adorable moments when he miscalculated a turn and tumbled into the grass. It didn't take long for Turbo to gain attention. People loved his story. They admired his resilience, his unstoppable energy, and the way he faced every challenge head-on. Comments poured in from all over the world. "I was feeling hopeless today, but watching Turbo has made me smile again. My son uses a wheelchair and he always felt different, but now, after seeing Turbo, he says he wants to be as strong as him. Thank you for sharing Turbo's journey. He reminds me that no matter what life throws at us, we can always find a way to keep moving forward." Emily was overwhelmed by the response. She had never expected a little chihuahua with no front legs to touch so many lives. But Turbo didn't just inspire people online, he was making a difference in real life too. One day, Emily received an email from a local children's hospital. They had seen Turbo's videos and wanted to know if she would bring him to visit some of the kids in long-term care. Many of them were facing disabilities or chronic illnesses, and they believed Turbo's story might lift their spirits. Emily didn't hesitate. The very next week, she and Jake took Turbo to the hospital. The moment they entered the children's ward, all eyes turned to the tiny dog rolling beside them. Some of the children gasped in surprise, while others immediately smiled. Turbo, oblivious to the attention, wagged his tail excitedly, eager to explore this new place. One little girl, no older than 6, was sitting quietly in a wheelchair near the window. She had lost one of her legs due to illness, and though the nurses had tried to encourage her to use her prosthetic, she had refused. But when Turbo rolled up to her, tail wagging, she looked at him curiously. Emily crouched down beside her. "This is Turbo. He was born without his front legs, but that never stopped him from living his best life." The little girl hesitated, then reached out, gently touching Turbo's head. "He doesn't seem sad," she murmured. Emily smiled. "No, he's too busy having fun." For the first time in weeks, the little girl laughed. Then, to everyone's surprise, she whispered, "Maybe I can try too." That visit changed everything. Soon, Turbo became a regular guest at the hospital, spreading joy wherever he went. He played with the children, let them take turns pushing him in his wheelchair, and reminded them that no matter what challenges they faced, they could still find happiness. Jake watched in awe as Turbo worked his magic. "I thought we were saving him," he said to Emily one evening. "But maybe he was meant to save others." Turbo's story continued to spread. Local news outlets picked up on his journey, and soon he was featured in articles, TV segments, and even a documentary about animals overcoming disabilities. Offers poured in. People wanted to donate, to help other disabled pets, and to learn more about how they could support animals like Turbo. But through it all, Turbo remained the same. A happy, playful chihuahua who simply loved to run. He didn't understand that he had become an inspiration. He didn't know that people all over the world looked at him and found strength in his story. All he knew was that life was meant to be enjoyed, no matter how different you were. And perhaps, in that simple truth, Turbo had taught the world something truly valuable.